She was 18, untouched by the world, and sold for a winter's supply of grain and a handful of gold eagles. Traded to a scarred, widowed mountain man with 3 wild children, her fate seemed sealed in the brutal Idaho snow. But what unfolded in that isolated cabin shocked everyone. The mud in the mining camp of Wallace, Idaho Territory was freezing into jagged ruts by the time November of 1884 rolled in. For 18-year-old Josephine Mercer, the creeping frost was the least of her worries. Her father, Jeremiah Mercer, had chased the promise of silver until it broke his spirit, leaving him with nothing but a hollow cough and a ledger of debts that threatened to cost him his life. He owed over $600 to Ezekiel Farnsworth, a ruthless saloon owner who preferred collecting his debts in blood or property. Josie knew her father was a broken man, but she never expected him to shatter her world to save his own skin. The transaction happened on a Tuesday. Josie was sweeping the dirt floor of their canvas-roofed shack when a shadow eclipsed the doorway. It wasn't Farnsworth. It was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the Bitterroot timber. Nathaniel Sterling was a name spoken in hushed, frightened tones by the townsfolk. A mountain man, a trapper, and a widower. He was a towering figure wrapped in heavy bear fur and elk hide, his face obscured by a thick, dark beard and a jagged scar that cut a stark white line across his left cheekbone. "The note is paid." Nathaniel's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the cramped shack. He didn't look at Josie at first. He tossed a heavy leather pouch onto the rickety table. It landed with the undeniable clink of heavy coins. Jeremiah couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. He stared at his calloused, trembling hands. "Josie," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Pack your things. You're going with Mr. Sterling. He needs a wife. A mother for his young'uns." The words hung in the frigid air, suffocating her. Given away. She was 18, a sheltered girl who had spent her days mending torn shirts and reading worn-out Bibles, and she had just been bartered away like a sack of winter flour. She was a virgin, untouched and terrified of the violent world of men. And now she belonged to a giant who smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and dried blood. "Pa, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please." Nathaniel finally turned his piercing, slate-gray eyes toward her. There was no warmth in them, only a tired, calculating assessment. "I leave in an hour, girl. Bring something warm." The snow is already deep at the pass. There were no tears, only a numb, paralyzing dread as Josie packed her single, modest trunk. She wrapped herself in her thin wool coat, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The townspeople watched from the wooden boardwalks as she climbed into the back of Nathaniel's heavy wagon. No one intervened. In the West, a man's property was his own, and a daughter was a commodity to be traded when the winter wind grew too sharp. The journey up into the Bitterroot Mountains took 3 agonizing days. Nathaniel rarely spoke. He drove the massive draft horses with silent commands, his rifle resting across his knees. At night, they camped in the snow. Josie slept in the back of the wagon, shivering and clutching a small carving knife beneath her blankets, terrified that the giant would finally come to claim his husbandly rights. But he never did. He slept by the fire, a silent sentinel against the howling wolves and the biting frost. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the wagon crested a steep ridge, revealing a sprawling valley locked in ice. Nestled against the tree line was a large, sturdy cabin built of massive, unpeeled logs. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, the only sign of life in the desolate, frozen wasteland. "We're here," Nathaniel said, his voice cutting through the whistling wind. Josie swallowed hard, her hands numb inside her mittens. She was entirely at this man's mercy, miles from civilization, from the law, from anyone who even knew her name. As the wagon rolled to a halt in front of the heavy oak door, Josie braced herself for whatever nightmare awaited her inside. She had been sold into servitude, a bride to a beast, and as she stepped down into the knee-deep snow, she felt the heavy oak door looming like the entrance to a tomb. The heavy door groaned on iron hinges, revealing a cavernous main room cast in the flickering orange glow of a massive stone hearth. The heat hit Josie like a physical blow, carrying with it the heavy sense of cured venison, damp wool, and unwashed bodies. Before her eyes could fully adjust to the dim light, Movement near the fireplace caught her attention. 3 children stood frozen, watching her with the wary, cornered intensity of wild animals. They were filthy. The youngest, a boy of about 4, peeked from behind a stack of firewood. His face was smeared with soot, his hair a tangled blonde bird's nest. Another boy, perhaps 8, stood rigidly by the table, clutching a carved wooden toy so tightly his knuckles were white. But it was the oldest who made Josie's breath catch in her throat. A girl of 12 stood dead center in the room. She had Nathaniel's piercing gray eyes, but they were alight with a fierce, unmistakable hatred. She wore a dress that was inches too short and frayed at the hem, and she held a heavy iron poker in her right hand as if ready to swing it. "This here is Josephine," Nathaniel announced, stepping into the cabin behind Josie and shaking the snow from his heavy furs. "She's your new ma." "She ain't our ma," the girl spat, her voice surprisingly sharp. "Our ma is dead." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Willa, put the iron down." For a long, tense moment, the girl named Willa didn't move. Then, with a loud clatter, she dropped the poker onto the hearth. "She won't last till the thaw," Willa muttered, turning her back and retreating into the shadows of the cabin. "That's Willa," Nathaniel said heavily, rubbing a hand over his scarred face. "The middle one is Samuel. The little one is Caleb. Show her where to put her trunk, Samuel." The boys scurried like frightened mice, helping drag her trunk to a corner of the room. Josie stood frozen, taking in the squalor of her new home. The floors were swept but stained. Stacks of animal pelts were piled haphazardly. It was clear this cabin had lacked a woman's touch for a long, long time. That night brought a new, suffocating terror for Josie. After a meager dinner of salted meat and hard biscuits, the children were sent to a loft above the main room. Josie stood awkwardly by the dying fire, her heart pounding as Nathaniel began to unlace his heavy leather boots. There was only one bed in the corner of the cabin, a large, heavy frame covered in bear skins. "You take the bed," Nathaniel said without looking at her. He pulled a thick buffalo robe from a peg on the wall and threw it on the floor near the hearth. Josie stared at him, bewildered. You aren't going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence, her cheeks burning hot. Nathaniel paused, his slate eyes meeting hers. "I bought your father's debt, Josephine, because my children are turning into feral animals, and I am gone trapping weeks at a time. I need someone to keep them alive. I didn't bring you up this mountain to force myself on a terrified child. You have the bed. Good night." He laid down, turning his back to her. Josie retreated to the bed, sliding under the heavy furs fully clothed. She lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howling against the logs and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the mountain man on the floor. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a chilling realization. He had paid a fortune for her, yet wanted nothing to do with her as a wife. Why? The answer began to surface 3 days later. Nathaniel had gone down the ridge to check his snare lines, leaving Josie alone with the children. Willa had refused to speak to her. Samuel hid in the loft, and Caleb simply sat by the fire, staring blankly. Determined to bring some order to the chaos, Josie decided to clean. She started with the heavy wooden wardrobe next to the bed. As she pulled out moth-eaten blankets to wash, her hand brushed against something hard, lodged behind a false panel at the back of the bottom drawer. Tugging at it, she pulled free a small leather-bound journal wrapped in a blood-stained linen handkerchief. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. She flipped it open. The handwriting was elegant, loops and curls of faded ink. It belonged to Harriet Sterling, the first wife. Josie scanned the pages. The early entries spoke of love, of the beautiful mountains, of building the cabin. But as she flipped toward the back, the handwriting grew erratic, frantic. October 12th. He is not the man I married. The winter changes him. There is a darkness in him that wakes when the snow falls. He stays out for days, and when he returns, there is blood on his hands that isn't from the animals. November 4th. I found the lockbox beneath the floorboards. Dear God, what has he done? If I try to leave, he will catch me. I have to stay for the children, but I fear I will not survive the frost. He knows I know. Josie's breath hitched in her throat. The town rumors said Harriet had died of winter fever. But this This read like the diary of a woman who knew she was going to be murdered. A sudden, sharp creak of floorboards behind her made Josie spin around. Willa stood in the doorway of the bedroom, her eyes fixed on the leather book in Josie's hands. The 12-year-old's face was pale, her expression an unreadable mix of terror and grim satisfaction. "You found it," Willa whispered, taking a slow step forward. "I hid it after they buried her." He told the sheriff she got sick. The girl paused, a sinister, knowing smile creeping onto her dirty face. "You shouldn't have come here, Josephine. My pa doesn't just trap animals, and once the snow blocks the pass, nobody ever leaves this mountain." The revelation paralyzed Josie. The leather-bound diary felt heavier than an anvil in her hands, its pages whispering of murder in a cabin that suddenly felt smaller, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Willa's venomous smile only deepened the dread settling in Josie's stomach. The 12-year-old girl wasn't just grieving. She was guarding a terrifying truth, waiting for the mountain to claim another victim. "You don't know what you're talking about," Josie managed to whisper, her voice trembling as she shoved the diary back into its hiding place behind the false drawer panel. "He's your father." "He's a butcher," Willa countered, her voice devoid of childhood innocence. She stepped closer, her slate-gray eyes boring into Josie. "You read it. You saw what my M.A. wrote. He goes out into the snow, and he comes back with blood that ain't from no deer or elk. He hides things beneath the floorboards. The night she died, they fought, screamed so loud it woke the baby. Then, silence. The next morning he told us the winter fever took her, but I saw the blood on the hearthstones before he scrubbed it away." Willa turned on her heel and marched out of the room, leaving Josie completely alone with her spiraling panic. Over the next 4 days, a suffocating tension gripped the cabin. The Bitterroot Mountains were notorious for their brutal, unforgiving winters, and the sky soon turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature plummeted, freezing the water in the wash basin solid. Josie kept herself busy, desperate to maintain a facade of normalcy. She baked hardtack, mended Samuel's torn woolen trousers, and managed to coax a rare, fleeting smile from little Caleb by carving him a small wooden horse. But her eyes constantly drifted to the heavy oak door. She was waiting for the monster to return. She waited until the children were asleep in the loft to search for the lockbox Harriet had mentioned. Using the iron fireplace poker, Josie pried at the heavy, rough-hewn pine boards near the foot of the bed. Most were nailed solid, but one board shifted under her weight. Heart-pounding, she wedged the poker beneath it and lifted. There, nestled in the dark, dusty cavity between the floor joists, was a heavy iron strongbox. It was locked with a thick brass padlock. Josie couldn't open it, but as she dragged it slightly to test its weight, she heard the unmistakable, heavy clink of shifting metal inside. Coins. A lot of them. Suddenly, the cabin hounds chained outside began to howl, a frantic, blood-curdling sound that cut through the whistling wind. Josie hastily shoved the box back, stomped the floorboard into place, and rushed to the main room just as the heavy door violently slammed open. A wall of white snow blew into the room, and with it, Nathaniel. He didn't walk in. He collapsed. The massive mountain man fell forward onto the hard dirt floor, taking the heavy door down with him. The wind howled through the breach, instantly extinguishing the oil lamps. "Pa!" Samuel shrieked from the loft. The boys jolted awake by the crash. Josie stood frozen in terror. This was the moment Harriet's diary had warned of. But as Nathaniel rolled over onto his back in the dim firelight, Josie saw that the blood soaking his heavy buffalo coat wasn't from a victim. It was his own. "Close. The door," Nathaniel gasped, his gravelly voice weak and wet. He clutched his left side, his massive fingers slick with crimson. Willa scrambled down the ladder, her eyes wide. For a second, Josie thought the girl might grab the rifle and finish him off, but instinct took over. Josie rushed forward, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the door, and hoisted it back into its frame, dropping the heavy wooden crossbar to lock out the raging blizzard. She knelt beside Nathaniel. The smell of copper and unwashed wool was overpowering. "What happened? Was it a bear?" she asked, her hands shaking as she tried to unbutton his heavy, blood-soaked coat. Nathaniel groaned, a terrible rattling sound deep in his chest. "No bear," he grunted, his eyes rolling back. "Lead." A gunshot wound. Josie tore open his shirt. Deep in his left side, just below the ribs, was a jagged, bubbling hole. It was a through-and-through shot, but he had lost a massive amount of blood. The storm outside was intensifying into a whiteout. There was no doctor within 50 miles, and the pass was already sealed by 6 feet of snow. "He's dying," Willa said. The girl stood over them, her face pale but her expression cold. "Let him die, Josephine. It's God's judgment." Josie looked from the bleeding giant to the spiteful child. A dark, tempting thought crossed her mind. If Nathaniel died, she would be free. She could take the gold from the lockbox beneath the floorboards, wait for the spring thaw, and leave this nightmare behind. She wouldn't be a piece of property anymore. Nathaniel's hand, freezing cold and trembling, suddenly clamped weakly around Josie's wrist. His slate eyes, clouded with pain, locked onto hers. He didn't beg. He just looked at the loft where Samuel and Caleb were crying. "Keep 'em safe," he whispered, before his eyes rolled back, and he passed out completely. Josie made her choice. "Willa, boil water." "Now," Josie commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, shocking the girl into action. "Samuel, bring me clean linen from the trunk. Caleb, stay in the loft." The next 24 hours were a gruesome, exhausting blur. Josie became a field surgeon out of sheer desperation. She cleaned the entry and exit wounds with boiling water and raw corn whiskey, the fumes burning her eyes. She packed the wounds with clean linen and bound his massive torso, her hands stained to the elbows in his blood. A raging fever set in by midnight. Nathaniel thrashed in his sleep, his immense strength requiring both Josie and Willa to hold him down so he wouldn't tear his stitches. In his delirium, the mountain man began to speak. "Don't do it, Hattie," he muttered, tossing his head. Sweat poured down his scarred face. "The boys, don't bring them here. Hattie, please. It's blood money." Josie froze, pausing the damp cloth she was using to cool his forehead. "Hattie, Harriet." "They'll kill the children, Hattie," Nathaniel raved, his voice cracking with a terrifying desperation Josie had never heard from him. "Farnsworth knows. He knows you kept it." Josie's blood ran cold. Ezekiel Farnsworth, the saloon owner who had bought her father's debt and orchestrated her sale to Nathaniel. Why was Nathaniel dreaming about his dead wife and Ezekiel Farnsworth? "I won't let them have the kids," Nathaniel suddenly roared, violently thrashing against Josie's hold. "I'll take the blame. I'll tell the sheriff it was me. Just leave the children be." Willa, standing at the foot of the bed with a fresh bowl of water, dropped the rag. She stared at her father, her lower lip trembling. "What is he saying?" she whispered, her voice stripped of its usual venom. "Why is he talking about Ma like that?" Josie looked at the heavy floorboards across the room, thinking of the locked iron box. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting, forming a picture that was vastly different and far more terrifying than the story of a murderous mountain man. It took 3 days for the fever to break. The blizzard outside raged with an unrelenting fury, burying the cabin up to its windows in packed snow. Inside, the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. When Nathaniel finally opened his eyes, clear and lucid for the first time since he collapsed, he found Josie asleep in a wooden chair beside the bed, her head resting on the edge of the mattress. Her hands were raw and blistered from scrubbing blood and tending the fire. He didn't speak, he just watched her. When she finally stirred and sat up, rubbing her tired eyes, she jumped at the sight of him awake. "You're alive," she breathed, a mixture of profound relief and lingering fear in her voice. Nathaniel tried to sit up but winced, falling back against the pillows. "You saved my life, Josephine." His gravelly voice was incredibly weak. "Why?" "Because I am not a murderer," Josie replied sharply, fetching him a tin cup of water. She helped him drink. "And because you owe me the truth. All of it." "Who shot you, Nathaniel? And what is in the iron box beneath the floorboards?" Nathaniel went completely still. His slate eyes darkened, staring past her at the ceiling. "You've been digging where you shouldn't." "I read Harriet's diary," Josie pressed, refusing to back down. "I know she thought you were going to kill her. I know about the blood. But when you had the fever, you talked. You begged her not to bring them here. You talked about blood money. And you talked about Ezekiel Farnsworth." At the sound of the saloon owner's name, Nathaniel squeezed his eyes shut. A deep, agonizing sigh racked his chest. Farnsworth, he spat the name like poison. He bought your pa's debt just to have an excuse to send you up here. He needed a set of eyes inside this cabin. He used you, girl. Used you to find out if I was dead yet, and if the gold was still here. Willa stepped out from the shadows near the hearth. She had been listening. What gold, Pa? What are you talking about? Ma said you were crazy with the winter sickness. Nathaniel looked at his oldest daughter, his expression shattering with a heartbreaking sorrow. He had kept this secret to protect her, but the truth was violently forcing its way into the light. Your mother, Nathaniel began, his voice breaking. Your mother wasn't the woman you thought she was, Willa. For the next hour, as the wind screamed outside, Nathaniel unburdened his soul. Harriet Sterling hadn't been a simple pioneer wife. Before she married Nathaniel, she was deeply entrenched with a violent syndicate of stagecoach robbers known as the Blackfoot Boys. Ezekiel Farnsworth was their fence, turning stolen gold into clean cash through his saloon. She tried to leave that life when we got married, Nathaniel explained, his gaze fixed on the fire. But the money, she couldn't resist. She started passing information to Farnsworth about the mining camp payrolls. She was the inside man. She hid their cut up here, beneath the floorboards. No, Willa whispered, stepping back. No, she wrote in her diary. She said you were a monster. She wrote that to cover her tracks, Nathaniel said gently. She knew the Blackfoot Boys were coming for the gold, and she knew I had found out what she was doing. She wanted to frame me. She planned to take you children and leave me for the hangman. The night she died. She didn't get sick, Willa. She pulled a Derringer pistol on me. We fought for it. It went off. She shot herself in the chest. Tears streamed down Willa's dirty face. She looked at Josie, then back at her father. Why didn't you tell the sheriff? Because if the law knew she was a thief and a spy, they would have taken you children away to an orphanage, Nathaniel said, tears finally spilling from his own eyes. And if the Blackfoot Boys knew she was dead and I had their gold, they would have come and slaughtered us all. So I buried her. I told everyone it was the fever. I let the town think I was a cruel, mad hermit, so people would stay away. I became the monster to keep the real monsters from coming up this mountain. The heavy silence in the cabin was deafening. Josie sat back in her chair, her mind reeling. The man she had been terrified of was not a beast. He was a fiercely devoted father who had sacrificed his entire reputation and carried the horrific burden of his wife's death to keep his children safe. Who shot you, Nathaniel? Josie asked quietly. Farnsworth's men, Nathaniel growled. I caught 2 of them on my trapping lines. They were scouting the perimeter. They're coming for the box, Josephine. And they aren't going to leave any witnesses. As if on cue, a sudden sharp crack echoed outside, louder than the howling wind. It wasn't a falling tree. It was the distinct sound of a Winchester rifle. Josie rushed to the frost-covered window, scraping a small circle clear with her fingernail. Through the swirling whiteout, she saw them, dark shapes moving through the trees. 5 men on horseback, bundled in heavy furs, their rifles drawn. They had braved the blizzard to claim the stolen gold. One of the cabin hounds, chained near the woodshed, let out a yelp that was abruptly cut short. They're here, Josie whispered, her blood turning to ice. Nathaniel groaned, forcing himself to sit up despite the bleeding wounds. He reached out a trembling hand toward the wall, where his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle hung on wooden pegs. Willa, take the boys. Get down into the root cellar beneath the kitchen, Nathaniel commanded, his voice suddenly hard and authoritative. Josephine, grab the shotgun by the door. Load it with buckshot. You can't fight them, Josie panicked, rushing to the door and pulling the double-barreled shotgun from its holster. You can barely stand. I don't have to stand to shoot. Nathaniel gritted his teeth, sliding his legs off the bed. The bandages around his waist immediately began to seep red. They want the gold. They want me dead. But I swear to God, they will not touch my family. He looked at Josie, his slate eyes burning with a fierce, protective fire that sent a strange jolt through her chest. In that moment, she realized she was no longer just a girl traded to pay a debt. She was part of this family. and she was going to have to fight to keep them all alive. The heavy thud of bootsteps sounded on the wooden porch outside. Then, a voice cut through the storm, muffled by the heavy oak door. "Sterling, we know you're in there, you bleeding dog. Send the girl out with the box, and we might just let the brats live." Josie cocked the hammers of the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack echoing loudly in the tense silence of the cabin. She looked at Nathaniel, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The real monsters had finally arrived, and the true battle for the mountain cabin was about to begin. The heavy oak door shuddered violently under the impact of a heavy wooden beam. Dust and snow sifted down from the rafters. Outside, the outlaws were using a freshly chopped pine log as a battering ram. "They won't stop until that door splinters," Nathaniel grunted, his face a mask of pale, sweating agony. He propped himself against the stone hearth, sliding the heavy barrel of his Sharps buffalo rifle onto a stack of firewood to steady his trembling hands. "Josephine, if they breach, you don't hesitate. You pull those triggers, and you don't look away." Josie gripped the shotgun, her knuckles bone white. The terrified whimpers of little Caleb drifted up from the root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards, echoing the frantic beating of her own heart. She was 18 years old. Just a month ago, she had fainted at the sight of a neighbor butchering a hog. Now, she was standing over a bleeding mountain man prepared to kill. Crash. The door held, but the front window did not. A heavy rock wrapped in a wool sack shattered the frosted glass. Instantly, the barrel of a Winchester rifle snaked through the jagged opening, blindly firing into the cabin. Bullets chewed through the wooden table and showered Josie with splinters. "Get down!" Nathaniel roared. He adjusted his aim, his finger squeezing the trigger of the Sharps. The massive rifle fired with a deafening boom that rattled Josie's teeth. A heavy slug tore through the log wall beside the window. Outside, a man screamed, and the Winchester dropped onto the snow-covered floorboards. "That's one," Nathaniel breathed, quickly working the breech to reload. 4 left. But the remaining men were seasoned killers, driven by the lure of the stolen gold. A voice boomed over the howling wind, a voice Josie recognized with a sickening lurch. It was Ezekiel Farnsworth. The saloon owner hadn't just sent his men. He had come to claim the fortune himself. "Sterling," Farnsworth shouted from the cover of the tree line, "I know Harriet is dead, and I know you're bleeding out. Give me the box, and I'll let the girl and the brats walk down the mountain." "He's lying," Willa shouted from the cellar trapdoor, her face pale but defiant. "Don't trust him, Pa." "I know, sweetheart," Nathaniel said softly. He looked at Josie. "They can't get through the door, so they're going to try to burn us out." As if validating his words, a flickering orange glow illuminated the swirling snow outside the shattered window. Farnsworth's men were lighting torches soaked in kerosene. The dry pine roof of the cabin would go up like tinder. "I have to get a clear angle," Nathaniel wheezed, struggling to push himself up. The blood soaking his bandages was spreading rapidly. "The loft window. It looks down on the porch." "You can't make it up the ladder," Josie said, dropping the shotgun and rushing to his side. She slung his massive arm over her shoulder. "Lean on me. We go together." Step by excruciating step, they navigated the wooden rungs of the loft ladder. Nathaniel's weight was crushing, and Josie felt her muscles screaming in protest. By the time they reached the upper floor, Nathaniel was barely conscious, his breathing a wet, ragged rasp. Below, the heavy thud of boots sounded on the porch. The glow of the torches grew blindingly bright. "Burn it!" Farnsworth's voice commanded. Nathaniel collapsed near the small, circular gable window. With agonizing slowness, he pushed the wooden shutter open. The freezing wind whipped into the loft. He slid the heavy barrel of the Sharps rifle onto the sill. Through the storm, Farnsworth stood boldly in the open, holding a blazing torch, preparing to hurl it onto the dry cedar shingles of the porch roof. "For Harriet," Nathaniel whispered. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking back violently. Down below, the torch fell from Farnsworth's hand, hissing as it hit the deep snow. The saloon owner stood frozen for a fraction of a second before collapsing backward into the snowdrift, a dark, expanding stain ruining his expensive wool coat. With their leader dead and the freezing blizzard threatening to bury them all, the remaining 3 outlaws lost their nerve. Josie watched through the gable window as the dark figures scrambled onto their horses, spurring the animals frantically down the treacherous mountain trail, disappearing into the whiteout. Silence, thick and heavy, fell over the cabin, broken only by the whistling wind and the crackle of the hearth fire below. Josie slumped against the wall, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She looked at Nathaniel. The giant mountain man had passed out again, his chin resting against his chest, but his chest was still rising and falling. They had survived. The winter that followed was the longest and most brutal on record in the Idaho Territory. But inside the sturdy log walls, a slow, profound thaw was occurring. Without the looming threat of Farnsworth and the Blackfoot boys, the suffocating tension evaporated. Josie stepped seamlessly into the role of matriarch. She rationed their flour and salted meat, kept the fires burning, and slowly nursed Nathaniel back from the brink of death. More importantly, she broke through the hardened shells of the children. She taught Samuel how to read from the worn Bible she had brought in her trunk. She spent hours whittling new toys for Caleb. And, slowly, cautiously, she earned Willa's respect. The 12-year-old stopped glaring at her and started helping her, the two of them working side by side to bake bread and haul firewood. By late April, the relentless snow finally surrendered to the warming sun. The Bitterroot Mountains erupted in a brilliant display of green pines, rushing meltwater creeks, and vibrant wildflowers. One crisp morning, Josie was sweeping the porch when Nathaniel walked out. He was completely healed, though a new, jagged scar now marked his left side. He carried the heavy iron strongbox in his hands. He set it down on the wooden planks at Josie's feet and pulled a small brass key from his pocket. With a click, the padlock gave way. Nathaniel pushed the heavy lid open. Inside sat rows of neatly stacked gold bars and heavy leather pouches overflowing with $20 gold double eagles. It was a staggering fortune. More money than Josie had ever seen in her entire life. "The pass is clear," Nathaniel said, his gravelly voice remarkably soft. He didn't look at the gold, he looked at her. "There's a stagecoach leaving Wallace for San Francisco in 2 days. The town thinks Farnsworth was killed by rival card sharks. No one is coming looking for this." Josie stared at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I bought your father's debt to save my children, and you did more than just save them." "You saved me," Nathaniel said, his slate-gray eyes vulnerable for the first time. "You were traded to a stranger, forced into a nightmare, and you stood your ground. You are free, Josephine. Take the gold. It's yours. Go to California. Live the life a beautiful, brave young woman deserves." Josie looked down at the glittering gold, then back up at the towering mountain man. She thought of the mining town, of her cowardly father, of the empty life she had left behind. Then she looked back into the cabin, where Willa and Samuel were laughing at something Caleb had done. She reached down, grabbed the heavy iron lid, and slammed the box shut. "I don't want the gold, Nathaniel," Josie said, stepping closer to him. The scent of pine resin and wood smoke that had once terrified her now felt like home. "And I don't want to go to California." Nathaniel swallowed hard, his hands resting awkwardly at his sides. "Josie, you're 18. I am a scarred old trapper with 3 kids and a whole lot of ghosts." "You are a good man," Josie corrected him fiercely, placing her hand against his chest, right over his heart. "A father who sacrificed everything to protect his family. And I am tired of being traded away. I'm making my own choice now." She looked up into his eyes. "I choose to stay." For a long moment, the only sound was the rushing of the mountain creek. Then Nathaniel's massive, calloused hands came up, gently cupping her face as if she were made of fragile glass. When he kissed her, it wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a profound, overwhelming surrender. That night, the heavy buffalo robe remained neatly folded on the floor. Josie Mercer, the terrified girl sold to clear a gambling debt, finally took her rightful place in the heavy timber bed, untouched no more, giving herself freely to the husband she had learned to fiercely love. The brutal winter had tried to break them, but it had only forged a family stronger than the mountain itself. The brutal winter didn't break Josephine. It forged her into the fierce matriarch of the Bitterroot Mountains. What started as a tragic sale became a legendary tale of survival, loyalty, and unexpected love. Did you enjoy this gritty Wild West romance? Hit that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life, historical dramas.